Oh, right. Well, we seem to have started. So, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to my channel, Lord London Stone, in which I discuss the heart of London and all the various sites and attractions which are available to see in the heart of London, and describe and discuss them. And I've just been to Westminster Abbey, and I'm in the middle of discussing Westminster Abbey and what it has to offer. What I want to talk a bit about now is the architecture of the building in its context with European architecture in general. Now, we have to go all the way back to Roman times to consider their ideas about architecture. They would build, typically, a basilica, which would be the largest and most important building in any town or city, with straight walls either side, and then to construct a roof, and putting a roof on the building was really the major problem. They'd put beams straight across of timber. That would be tall trees would have to be cut down and then placed in such a way that they could make a roof with a flat ceiling and then a pitched roof rather like that over it. So that was the general style that was adopted throughout Roman times. When you were building in buildings of stone, some mostly in wood, most buildings were built in wood and of course have not survived. But the Romans were very clever at building the semicircular arch, and you can see that in their aqueducts. So what you had was a keystone right at the top, and then you had other segments of archway placed in a semicircle, the idea being that the weight of the wall above would press down upon the arch and keep the stones in place. And it was only a very small development from there to then create the semicircular vault, which appeared in some of the cathedrals of Western Europe from about the 10th century or thereabouts, particularly in France, which in fact was the leading country in Western Europe at the time. So very commonly you had, when they wanted to build a roof on a cathedral, you would have two walls at the side, and the point was that they wanted a large building, the walls would have to expand, and it was difficult to find trees that were tall enough to cross over at the top to make a sturdy beam. So that is why they then went in to produce these vaulted roofs. So you had these semicircular vaulted roofs on the great cathedrals of France from around about the year 900, 1000, going towards 1100. And the best example in Britain is Durham Cathedral. And this style is known as the Romanesque, after the Roman adaptation of the Roman arch and the vault. So that was the prevailing style for all cathedrals. The problem, of course, as they started to make the cathedrals wider and wider, it meant that they had to start creating larger vaulted roofs, and this was a problem because the stone from the vaulted roofs would press down on the walls. So the walls had to then be fortified with buttresses on either side. Otherwise, it would become very difficult to build a wall that was strong enough to hold up the roof. That was the problem, and eventually it was solved in around about, the early 1100s with the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris. That's when they first started using this style of architecture that we call Gothic, which they called Opus Frankiganum, which just simply means French work. And Gothic architecture went in for the lancet windows with the point, which you're probably familiar with, and also the what we call the flying buttresses. Now the buttress was there at the side of the buildings originally to hold up and support the walls, but the idea is by building a flying buttress, you could get the weight of the roof would all be pressing down into the flying buttress and take it all the way down to the ground, whereas the wall on either side could be really quite relatively thin, and that meant that if you had a thin wall you could then build these large windows, stained glass windows, to allow in the natural sunlight, and that was the great attraction of them. Also, you had the ribbed vaulting in Gothic architecture, which meant that they cut the ceiling up into segments, so if ever there was a problem with the roof or the ceiling, it could be managed in the small segments. If there was a problem with the roof or the ceiling in the semicircular vaulted buildings, the whole building would have to be taken down in order to deal with it, but they could just deal with one segment of the roof or the ceiling with the ribbed vaulting. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, just to give you an idea of the principle. You have the Gothic buildings. Now with Gothic buildings, of course, we call Gothic buildings, you can really start building as high as you like. Some of the buildings of Gothic architecture, the great Gothic cathedrals, reached up to a height of almost 500 feet. In fact, St. Paul's Cathedral, old St. Paul's Cathedral, when it was built in the 1300s, had a spire that reached almost 500 feet. It was actually knocked down. It was struck by lightning in the Tudor period. But also the spire on Lincoln Cathedral was even taller. And that, of course, came down, unfortunately, because, well, it was too high, I suppose. But the heights of the Gothic spires were really quite prodigious. The tallest buildings in the world at the time. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my little presentation on Gothic architecture. Gothic architecture eventually started fading out towards the end of the 1400s, the beginning of the 1500s, and the arrival of the Renaissance, when people started going back to copying what they thought was the Roman styles with the ideas of Andrea Palladio. And I'll talk more about that a bit later on, but I just want to focus on Gothic. We had a revival of Gothic in the Victorian period in Britain. They had tried that before, but it wasn't really using the principles of Gothic architecture. It was the principles of Gothic decoration. Now you see that at the front of Westminster Abbey, with the towers that were added by Nicholas Hawksmoor in 1735. Obviously he wanted the architecture to blend in with the medieval cathedral, although Hawksmoor used what they call the Baroque style. You also see Gothic architecture, or Gothic decoration I should say, on the Houses of Parliament, which I'll be talking about a little bit later on. But that again is a subject for another video. So thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you keep in touch, and I'll just say over and out for the time being.